If you've ever played Undertale, you might know this guy, Sans. Friendly skeleton turned defender of the underworld, is one of the game's final bosses. But why? Well, why do we call him a boss? Does he run a company? Is he listed in some sort of underworld hierarchy? For Sans, the answer is largely no. But we still call him a boss because he provides a very difficult fight at the end of a particular segment. So, why do we do this? If he's not physically bossing anyone around, why not just call him the final monster, or more simply, the last enemy? This brings into question which criteria even label a boss fight as such. Not all bosses are even at the end. You get mid-bosses, mini-bosses, secret bosses, boss rushes. What is it that even makes a boss fight a boss fight? Hell, why are games even structured like this in the first place? Why fight against one big, powerful enemy to round things out? We've only just started with our original question, and we've already got plenty more to ask. So maybe the best place to start will be the first ever proper boss fight in a video game. Now, what was that? You might have heard about Dungeons & Dragons. Making its tabletop debut in 1974, D&D would go on to be a hugely influential board game, especially so for the role-playing video games in the decade that followed. And the first example we have of this inspiration didn't come long after the game's release. The aptly titled D&D for the Plato system, released in 1975, took very direct cues from its tabletop predecessor. You create a character, roam a dungeon, and then slay a dragon. This dragon retroactively became the first proper boss fight in video game history, but nobody called it a boss at that time. The golden dragon, which defends the orb, is simply another enemy you must defeat on your quest, and it just so happens to be the very last enemy. The dragon is beefy, a baddie on steroids, some dubbed it, but it's not the first boss to be dubbed as such. So the D&D dragon doesn't give us much to work with. Jumping forward, who was the first to name an enemy a boss? That would be the creators of 1980 trap 'em up, Space Panic. There are three enemies you face in this game: the monster, the boss, and the Don. And as having a boss might imply, there is a hierarchy in operation. Monsters are the easiest to kill, while Dons are the most powerful. The boss, however, is placed squarely in the middle of this hierarchy. While some have claimed Space Panic is where the term boss originated, the boss here isn't even the most powerful enemy, let alone a segmented boss in the traditional sense. And given Space Panic's relatively weak reception upon release, although it would go on to be cloned incessantly, it seems doubtful that this is the term's true origin. It didn't have the reach to make the term spread. And there's one other thing that those in the back of the arcade might be keen to correct me on. What about Galaxian's Gal boss a year before? Sometimes dubbed rather blandly as the Galaxian command ship, the iconic Gal boss fits the bill at first sight. It's at the top of its hierarchy, stronger than its underlings. It doesn't have an exclusive screen, but it otherwise checks boxes, and it has extensive recognition in the canon of gaming. This is where bosses must come from, right? Well, not quite. Or perhaps not at all. Actually, there's no concrete evidence showing the Galaxian command ship was called a boss by anyone until at least 4 years after Galaxian came out. And by that time, of course, its flashy sequel Galaga had made the rounds. The first documentation of any spaceship being called a boss was in Joystick magazine's 1983 issue. Take a wild shot in Galaga, you might fire at the boss. But now it gets even more confusing, since we're talking about a different enemy entirely. This is a bug-like creature that would later be dubbed Boss Galaga, not the Galaxian command ship we were originally talking about. How did a kind of Mandela effect occur here? Many have claimed these bosses to be the first ones that they ever heard about. But did anyone call them bosses in the arcades? Probably not. But they probably did in their homes. In the mid-80s, when Galaga was ported to consoles in Japan, manuals used the term Boss Galaga to describe the enemy. Namco have used both Gal Boss and Boss Galaga as official terms ever since. Maybe they borrowed it from Joystick. But let's get real. Neither of these are bosses, right? Regardless of their confusing origin, nobody today would look at these enemies let alone analyze them, and treat them as traditional video game bosses. With the way bosses work today, this terminological transfer just doesn't make any sense. The question we should be asking is, when did boss screens become commonplace? Or, better question, why did these boss screens become commonplace? To answer that, we have to go back even further than before. Not much further, mind you, the early 70s to be specific, the height of martial artist Bruce Lee's fame. His blockbusters, such as Game of Death, put him in one-on-one fights against enemies who become more and more difficult as the film goes on. In other hits, like The Big Boss, he fights gangster underlings until meeting up with their leader, finishing the movie with an epic final fight. And without having ever intended it, these kinds of sequences played a key role in defining what the fighting games of the early 80s would look like, both on home consoles and the arcades. Sasuke vs. Commander by SNK, released in 1980, was the first game to include a proper boss fight where the enemy was officially dubbed as a boss. Sasuke would fight underlings of the boss ninja before fighting the boss one-on-one, a structure that closely mirrored Lee's film, The Big Boss. Boss screens saw further use in the mid-80s when home consoles made direct references to Lee. Games such as Bruce Lee for the Commodore 64, ER Kung Fu, and Way of the Exploding Fist also took similar inspirations. A particularly good example is Kung Fu Master, or Spartan X in Japan. When British journalist Mike Roberts reviewed the game, he struggled to find a good name for the tough super baddies who followed the standard baddies. But he doesn't struggle with the final opponent, X, who he calls the boss of the organisation. From that time onward, video game journalists were adapting the term boss a lot more frequently, primarily because in Japan, the term bossu was becoming commonplace as well. Bossu was used to describe SNK's Boss Ninja, and, as we've already seen, was being used in Namco's home releases around 85. But most notably, it was picked up by Nintendo, who would properly embed the term in the English gaming lexicon. Bossu is a loanword from English, literally meaning boss, used to describe the leader of a mafia gang or some other criminal organisation, particularly in cinema, although it is used occasionally to describe leaders of animal packs, such as the famous Boss Monkey at Takasaki-Yama Natural Zoo. It was a word well placed to describe final fights, whether the enemy was human or non-human, that were becoming commonplace in Japanese games. As such, Nintendo sort of gave the loan word back to us when publishing in the West. Nintendo was responsible not only for popularising the term, but also for pushing it onto different species. In Nintendo's 1986 game, Metroid, the manual refers to Ridley and Kraid as mini-bosses. While the final boss, Mother Brain, isn't explicitly called a boss, boss status is still inferred due to the game's structure. Ridley and Kraid have to be defeated before we can access that final fight. And while it wasn't Nintendo's game, another prime example is the NES release of Double Dragon. While Sega's Master System manual for the game describes enemies under the umbrella term of the Black Warriors, the NES manual was notably more specific. Jimmy Lee is the Shadow Boss, Abobo is the Middle Boss, while Willy is the Big Boss. It would be Nintendo Power, however, which really pushed the term boss onto a wider audience. Taking authority as the go-to Nintendo guide when the NES was heating up, it achieved widespread popularity in America, and forced other gaming magazines to take note. The July-August 1988 issue saw the first frequent usage of boss across the mag. The Birdo in Mario 2, World 1-2, is described as the Little Boss, and other end-level enemies, like Tride get the same treatment. Meanwhile, end-level enemies in X3 worlds, such as Mouser, are referred to simply as a boss. And there's more. Boss enemy was used in the Zelda guide. In the first Counselor's Corner, someone writes in asking how to beat 5 Castlevania bosses. The writers redub areas in Double Dragon, labelling certain portions as boss rooms. And from there, boss became the go-to term when describing the now quintessential final fight of any video game. Other magazines soon picked up the term, and more importantly, gamers used it in conversation on a regular basis. The boss, as we know it today, was born. Video games, just like any other mass media, affect our language in ways we won't ever see coming. But if there's one thing we've learned today, it's that games latch onto existing words in weird ways, often affecting the way we think about language itself. Bosses are far from the only example. What about avatars? Or consoles? Even invented words like glitches, noobs. There's an endless amount of etymological mysteries in video games, and I'm on a mission to uncover more about why we communicate the way we do in the internet age. My quest is far from over. Next time on this series, I'll be taking a look at experience points, or XP, taking a deep dive into its early usage and investigating just how such a system became so widespread. So, until next time, thanks for watching.
That's him. This is it. This is it. He's gonna get me. He's gonna go really fast now. Oh. Oh. Oh, come on. You don't have to rub it in, man. That's the end? He just trips over and dies. Okay.